had decided to take a short solo trip into the woods and rent a small cabin for a few days. I wanted quiet more than anything. No emails, no calls, no neighbors slamming car doors at midnight. Just trees, cold air, and time to clear my head. The cabin was about as basic as they come. It sat back off a dirt road, maybe a mile and a half from where I had to park my car because the track was too rough to drive further. Carrying my pack that distance in was tiring, but when I finally saw the little building through the trees, I thought it was worth it. The cabin had a small porch with 2 steps leading up, a single room with a cot, a table, and an old cast iron stove. No electricity, no running water. It was exactly what I wanted, simple and away from people. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, chopped some wood that had been left stacked nearby, cooked a meal on the stove, and went to bed early. The forest around the cabin was quiet except for an occasional gust of wind and the distant sound of an owl. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was heavy, boots, not the quick patter of an animal. Slow, measured steps across the wooden boards, the kind of pacing you hear when someone walks back and forth, back and forth. I lay still on the cot, my heart beating hard in my chest. I stared at the thin curtains that covered the windows, but no shadows passed over them. Whoever or whatever it was stayed on the porch. The sound went on for what felt like hours. Every time I thought it had stopped, the pacing started again. Slow steps toward one end of the porch, a pause, then steps back to the other. The boards creaked with each one. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stayed in that cot with the blanket pulled up to my chest, staring at the dark ceiling. The footsteps never tried the door. They never came around the side to look into the window, just pacing back and forth, steady and patient. When the gray light of dawn finally came, the sound had stopped. I forced myself to get up and open the door. The porch was empty. The dirt around it showed no clear footprints, just the usual scattering of pine needles and leaves. My stomach tightened when I saw that. The ground wasn't muddy, but still, I expected to see some sign. Instead, nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe the wood shifting in the cold night. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I know what footsteps sound like. That day I tried to distract myself. I hiked along a creek for a few hours, gathered more wood, and cooked another meal. By evening, I had convinced myself not to overthink it. I locked the cabin door, sat with a lantern on the table, and read until my eyes were heavy. But sometime after midnight, the sound came back. The same heavy pacing, slow and deliberate, across the porch. This time, it started earlier. I sat upright in bed, staring at the door. The sound was so clear it was impossible to ignore. Whoever it was walked to the far end of the porch, paused, then walked back, over and over. I couldn't understand why they didn't try to come in. The door wasn't sturdy. A good shove could break it open, but the pacing never changed. It was like they wanted me to know they were there, but not see them. The hours dragged on. My eyes burned from staying open. My muscles were tight from not moving. Every creak of the boards made me flinch. By morning, the sound faded again. When I finally opened the door, the porch looked the same, empty, undisturbed. I checked the trees, the path leading back to the road, the clearing around the cabin. Nothing. On the third night, I decided to stay awake. I built a small fire in the stove to keep me warm and sat at the table with my lantern, watching the door. Midnight came, and so did the footsteps. The same pattern, back and forth. But this time I noticed something I hadn't before. The sound of the boards gave the impression of weight. Whoever it was, they were big. Too heavy for a deer, too measured for a bear. It was a person. I wanted to look out the window, but fear kept me frozen. If I pulled back the curtain and someone was staring back, I don't know what I would have done. My skin crawled at the thought. I sat there for hours, every nerve in my body on edge. The pacing never faltered. It didn't speed up, it didn't stop at the door, it didn't wander into the clearing. Just back and forth. I tried to tell myself it had to be someone lost, maybe drunk, maybe not fully aware of what they were doing. But 3 nights in a row, the same pattern, that wasn't random. By the 4th day, I was running on almost no sleep. I felt shaky and clumsy. My chest ached from tension. Couldn't eat much. Every noise in the woods made me jump. I considered leaving, but the thought of walking a mile and a half back to my car with someone possibly watching the cabin made me hesitate. If they were out there, if they had been waiting all night just beyond the porch, they could be anywhere in those trees. That night, the pacing returned again, heavier than ever. The boards groaned under each step. I lay on the cot, unable to move, too tired to keep sitting up. The sound became almost hypnotic in its repetition, but every time my body tried to drift towards sleep, fear snapped me awake. At some point, I realized something new. The steps stopped for longer pauses now. Long silences, broken by a sudden creak as though the person was leaning on the railing, standing still, just listening. I imagined them standing inches from the door, their ear pressed to the wood, listening to my every breath. The night seemed endless, but finally, as always, the sound faded with the light of morning. When I opened the door this time, I looked closer at the porch. Near the far edge, faint impressions marked the dusting of pine needles on the boards. They weren't clear shoe prints, but there was enough of a scuff to tell me it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been there. I didn't pack slowly. I shoved everything into my pack, barely caring if it fit right. I doused the stove, shouldered my bag, and walked out without looking back. The trail back to the car felt twice as long, every crack of a branch making me spin around. I kept imagining someone stepping onto the trail behind me, following at the same steady pace I'd heard all night. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear inside and drove without stopping until I saw pavement. My chest only loosened once I was miles away, but even then I kept checking the rearview mirror. To this day, I don't know who it was. Maybe a hermit living in the woods. Maybe someone who knew the cabin was rented and wanted to scare whoever stayed there. Maybe someone planning to do worse, waiting for the right night. All I know is that for 3 nights, someone stood on that porch, pacing back and forth while I lay trapped inside, too scared to move. And the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake sometimes even now, is wondering why they never came in. When my family decided to rent a cabin for a week in the mountains, I was looking forward to the quiet. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, screens, traffic, the constant noise of daily life. The place looked perfect when we pulled up. It sat tucked back from a dirt road, surrounded by pines, with a small clearing out front and a wide porch. The wood was weathered but not falling apart. It looked like the kind of place where people could sit and drink coffee while listening to the wind move through the trees. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A main living room with an old stone fireplace, 2 bedrooms off to the side, a small kitchen with just enough counter space to prepare a meal, and a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom. The ceiling beams were exposed, and the whole place smelled faintly of wood smoke, as though it had absorbed years of fires being burned in that fireplace. We settled in quickly. My parents took the larger bedroom, and my brother and I shared the smaller one. The first night was uneventful. I lay awake longer than I expected, mostly from the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin. Every building makes its own sounds, and when you aren't used to them, they can make your imagination run. I figured it was just wood shifting or the wind outside. The second day went smoothly too. We hiked during the afternoon, came back tired, cooked dinner, and then sat around the fire playing cards. The cabin was warm, the lights dim, and everything felt fine. But that night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but sharp enough to bring me fully awake. It sounded like movement above me, directly above me. At first I thought maybe it was an animal on the roof, but the sound wasn't like scratching or skittering. It was heavy, slow, like someone trying to be careful about each step. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate shuffle. Then it stopped. My heart pounded so hard that it drowned out everything else. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe would contracting with the temperature drop. I forced myself back to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The next morning, I mentioned hearing something, but brushed it off. I didn't want to start any panic or ruin the trip. During the day, nothing felt wrong. The cabin looked the same. The only thing I noticed was that a door at the end of the hallway, one I assumed was just a closet, had a padlock on it. I thought maybe it led to a storage area or crawl space. That struck me as normal enough for a rental property. That night, though, the noise came again, louder this time, more insistent. I could hear slow pacing, followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled across wood. It stopped and started as though whoever or whatever was up there was pausing to listen. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. It felt too deliberate. I got up in the middle of the night and walked quietly into the living room. I didn't hear anything from there, but the cabin felt wrong. The air felt heavy, tense. I stood near the fireplace for a long time, straining to hear. Eventually, I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I started noticing small things I had overlooked before. A half-empty water bottle tucked behind some logs near the fireplace. A faint but sour smell in the hallway, like sweat that had soaked into fabric and gone stale. My brother swore he had left his phone charger in the kitchen, but when he went to grab it, it was gone. Later that same day, he found it in the bathroom sink. No one admitted to moving it. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I stayed awake on purpose. I wanted to hear it clearly, to confirm it. Sure enough, the sound came back. A long creak above the living room, a pause, then another. It was moving, slowly, carefully. I turned off the lamp beside my bed and sat in the dark, listening. My mouth went dry when I heard it stop right above my room. The ceiling seemed thinner than ever. I could almost picture a man crouched above me in the dark, waiting. The next morning, I checked the cabin more thoroughly. While my parents were cooking breakfast, I slipped into the hallway and studied that locked door again. The padlock wasn't big, and the door frame looked weak. It didn't take much pressure to realize that the wood could be pried open if someone wanted to. That made me think, what if it wasn't just a closet? That night, I heard it again, but this time it was worse. I swear I heard breathing. Heavy, slow breathing that didn't match anyone sleeping in the cabin. I lay rigid in bed, every muscle in my body tight. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone, but something held me back. Maybe fear of being wrong. Maybe fear of being right. The next day, I finally decided to act. When everyone went outside for a walk, I stayed behind, claiming I wasn't feeling great. As soon as they were gone, I grabbed the fireplace poker and went to the locked door. My hands were shaking as I pried at the frame. It gave way faster than I expected, splintering around the padlock. I pulled the door open and stared at the narrow staircase leading upward. The smell hit me first, a mixture of unwashed clothes, damp wood, and something sour. I climbed slowly, poker in hand, my pulse thudding in my ears. At the top was a small attic space, dark except for a sliver of light coming from a vent. And there, in the corner, was proof that someone had been living up there. A sleeping bag laid out on the floor, empty food wrappers, a small stack of clothes, filthy and wrinkled, a plastic bag filled with bottles of water. And on the wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were marks. Tallies, dozens of them, like someone was keeping track of days. My stomach turned cold. Whoever it was, they had been here a long time. Longer than we had been renting. Maybe weeks, maybe months. I backed down slowly, closed the door as best I could, and forced the broken frame to look undisturbed. When my family returned, I didn't say anything. Not yet. That night, I barely slept, listening for every sound. The following morning, I told my parents I had broken into the attic. I showed them what was up there. We packed our things immediately, barely speaking, every one of us moving as if the walls had eyes. None of us wanted to confront whoever had been up there, in case they came back. We drove away fast, not looking back. I kept thinking about the tallies scratched into the wall, about the breathing I had heard at night, about the things that had gone missing. He had been watching us, moving while we were sleeping, maybe even coming down while we were gone. We reported it to the rental company and later to the police. They said they'd check it out, but by then, it didn't matter. We were gone, and the thought of what might have happened if we had stayed longer was enough to leave me with a knot in my stomach that still hasn't gone away. To this day, I can't sleep in a cabin without thinking of that attic, without wondering if someone is up there, listening to every move, waiting for the right moment. When we first pulled up to the cabin, it seemed almost too perfect. It was tucked into the trees at the end of a narrow dirt road, the kind of place you only saw in brochures about rustic weekend getaways. A small wooden porch, a couple of rocking chairs, smoke stains on the stone chimney. It looked like the kind of spot where someone could disappear from the world for a while. That's exactly what we wanted. The rental description had made it clear. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors within walking distance. Just a cabin, a creek down the hill, and miles of forest on all sides. After weeks of city noise, it sounded like paradise. We unpacked our bags, hauled in the groceries, and made the place feel lived in. The cabin was small but comfortable. 1 bedroom, a loft with a second bed, a little living room with a couch and wood stove, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar. The first day passed easily. We cooked, walked down to the creek, sat on the porch until the sun dropped and the air grew cold. The woods went dark quickly, and the only light came from the thin silver of the moon and our lanterns inside. I remember thinking how complete the silence felt. No hum of traffic, no voices carrying from down the street, just the occasional crack of a branch or the sigh of the wind. The next morning, we decided to drive into the nearest small town, which was about 30 minutes away. We wanted to pick up some extra supplies and grab lunch. The road was rough, and the cabin felt far behind us by the time we reached pavement. Felt good, though, knowing the place was tucked away and private. When we returned later that afternoon, something was different. At first, I didn't notice it because I was carrying a bag of groceries and watching my step on the uneven path. But when I looked up at the cabin, my stomach dropped. There was an axe leaning against the front door. Not just any axe, the kind of heavy woodcutter's axe you see buried in stumps, with a long wooden handle and a thick steel head. It was propped carefully against the door frame, the blade resting flat against the wood, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. We hadn't left it there. In fact, we hadn't seen an axe anywhere around the cabin when we arrived. There was no chopping block, no stack of wood that looked freshly cut. Whoever had placed it there had done so while we were gone. The air felt heavier immediately. The forest around the clearing seemed too quiet. I stood frozen on the path, staring at it, while my thoughts scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was just the owner, I told myself. Maybe they dropped by to leave us a tool in case we wanted to split more firewood. But the sight of it, the way it leaned so deliberately against the door, didn't feel helpful. Felt like a message. I walked up slowly, every step echoing too loud in my ears. The groceries felt like dead weight in my arms, but I didn't want to set them down. The closer I got, the clearer it became that the axe wasn't dusty or weathered from sitting outside. It looked used. The handle was smooth from hands gripping it. The blade had faint marks, as though it had been swung at wood recently. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to leave it either. After a long moment, I leaned the groceries against the porch rail and grabbed the handle. It was heavier than I expected. I set it aside, flat on the porch, and tried to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. Inside, the cabin looked untouched. Nothing was out of place. The door hadn't been forced, the windows were still latched. But I couldn't shake the image of someone standing there while we were gone, holding that axe, deciding to leave it for us to find. That night, the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. The silence outside wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. I kept thinking I heard things. Branches cracking closer than before, faint movement beyond the tree line. When I lay in bed, every creak of the cabin made me sit up, heart racing. The axe stayed on the porch. I couldn't bring myself to carry it inside. I told myself that if it was out there, it meant no one had come back for it. But I also knew it meant that whoever left it knew exactly where we were staying and exactly when we were gone. The next morning, I checked the clearing more carefully. I walked the edge of the trees, scanning the ground. I didn't find clear footprints, but I saw patches where the pine needles looked disturbed, as if someone had stood there recently, watching, maybe. We debated leaving, but part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it really had been the owner. Maybe there was no danger at all. Still, I couldn't enjoy the day the way I had before. The thought of that axe leaned against the door sat heavy in my mind. That evening, as the sun dropped, I gathered all our things and packed them tight. I didn't say much, but I knew I wasn't going to spend another night there. My nerves were stretched thin. The woods no longer felt empty. They felt occupied, as though eyes followed us from the shadows. Before we left, I walked out to the porch one last time. The axe still sat where I had laid it. I didn't touch it again. Instead, I looked at the doorframe where it had first been propped. The faint outline of the blade's edge was still visible on the wood. We loaded up the car quickly and drove down the rough road as the sky turned dark. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. We didn't stop until we hit the highway, and even then, I couldn't relax. Later, when I called the rental company to mention what had happened, they sounded confused. They told me there wasn't supposed to be an axe at the cabin. No caretaker had been scheduled to visit. No one had permission to be there. They apologized, said they'd look into it, but that didn't ease the knot in my chest. What unsettles me the most isn't the thought of someone trying to break in or steal something. It's the quiet decision behind placing that axe against the door. They didn't swing it, they didn't threaten directly. They left it standing there, waiting to be noticed. It was deliberate. It was meant to be seen. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whoever put it there had stood on that porch for a long time, staring at the door, listening to the silence of the empty cabin, and deciding exactly what message they wanted us to take home. We had rented the cabin with one thing in mind: fishing. The lake stretched wide and quiet, just a short walk downhill from the porch, and the cabin itself was nothing more than a wooden box tucked in the trees. It had 2 small bedrooms, a main room with a wood stove, and a porch that faced the water. No electricity, no phone signal, just silence broken by the slap of waves against the dock and the calls of loons echoing across the lake. It was supposed to be a simple trip. We'd fish during the day, cook what we caught, sit by the fire at night. The first couple of days went exactly like that. We settled into the rhythm of it quickly. The mornings were cool, the afternoons warmed by the sun, and the nights filled with stars so clear they looked like they'd been painted onto the sky. By the third morning, we had gotten into the habit of heading down to the dock right after breakfast. We packed up our rods, tackle, and a small cooler, then locked the cabin door behind us before heading down the path to the lake. That day the water was calm, the kind of glassy smooth that made every ripple stand out. We lost track of time out there, watching our lines, talking little, just soaking in the quiet. It was past midday when we finally made our way back up the hill. From a distance, nothing seemed wrong. The clearing looked the same, the cabin stood the same way it always had. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The front door was wide open. Not cracked, not swinging, open all the way. Both doors, because the cabin had a main wooden one and a lighter screen door. They stood open like someone had pushed them wide and walked inside. The porch looked undisturbed, the steps clear, but the sight of those doors yawning open stopped us in our tracks. I remember the first thought that hit me. Someone had been inside while we were gone. Maybe they still were. We set down the cooler and stood there for a long moment, listening. The clearing was dead silent. No voices, no movement, just the faint rustle of trees in the breeze. After gathering enough nerve, I walked up onto the porch and peered inside. The cabin looked normal. Our bags were where we left them. The table still had the deck of cards from the night before. The stove was cold. Nothing looked moved, nothing broken. Still, I felt the prickle of unease crawl across my skin. We went room to room, checking carefully. Both bedrooms were the same as we'd left them. The bathroom was empty. Even the kitchen shelves looked untouched. Nothing missing, nothing added. Just the doors left standing open. It didn't make sense. I checked the lock on the main door. It wasn't damaged. The latch on the screen wasn't broken either. Both had been undone cleanly. That was the part that stuck with me. It wasn't as though wind had blown the doors open or an animal had forced its way in. Someone had unlatched them and left them open wide. For the rest of the day, none of us could relax. We tried to brush it off. Maybe the owner had stopped by, maybe a ranger, but the question kept circling. Why wouldn't they close the doors after? Why leave them standing open like that? We cooked dinner as usual, but the food tasted flat. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to move again on its own. As darkness fell, the unease thickened. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. Every crack of a branch outside made me freeze. Every gust of wind felt like a presence pressing against the cabin. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, I thought I heard something faint outside. A single step on the porch boards, the kind of creak you know isn't the wind. My chest went tight, and I held my breath, but no other sound followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have just been the wood shifting with the cold. The next morning, the doors were still shut, just as we had locked them. That almost made it worse. Proved nothing accidental had happened the day before. Someone had been there, opened them, and left without taking a thing. We went fishing again, but this time I couldn't focus on the water. My mind stayed on the cabin up the hill, on the wide open doors, on the thought of someone stepping inside while our backs were turned. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see movement. When we finally walked back up that afternoon, I felt a knot in my stomach until the cabin came into view. This time the doors were closed. Nothing seemed wrong, but I couldn't shake the memory of how they'd looked the day before, open wide like an invitation or a warning. By the last night of the trip, I had decided something clearly. It didn't matter that nothing was missing. The point wasn't what had been taken. It was the fact that someone had been there at all, close enough to touch our things, close enough to stand in the rooms we slept in, and deliberate enough to leave the doors open for us to find. That final night, I barely slept again. Every sound outside made me picture someone standing in the clearing, waiting for us to come out. I realized that the worst part of it wasn't the fear of being robbed. It was the not knowing what they wanted. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken food or money or gear. They had just left a sign that they had been there. The next morning, we packed up fast. None of us said much as we loaded the car. We didn't want to admit how unsettled we all felt. Before I shut the cabin door one last time, I stood in the doorway and looked inside. Everything was exactly as it had been, but it felt hollow, like the walls remembered something we didn't. Driving away, I kept replaying the image of those doors wide open, the dark interior waiting behind them. It struck me that whoever did it knew exactly when we'd be gone long enough for them to walk in. Maybe they'd been watching us from the woods. Maybe they knew our routine when we headed down to the lake and how long we stayed. That thought has stayed with me more than anything else. The doors left open weren't just a random act. They were proof that someone knew our movements, knew our absence, and wanted us to know they'd been there. And the fact that they hadn't taken anything, that's the part that still unsettles me most. Because it means whatever reason they had for being inside, it wasn't about stealing. It was something else. Something I'd rather never understand. I rented a small cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a week in late fall, wanting quiet, space, and a break from the constant noise of my regular life. It was one of those old-fashioned log cabins, simple but cozy, tucked away off a gravel road that wound deeper into the woods than I thought my car would manage. The place had a stone fireplace, rough wooden floors, and a screened-in porch with a view of the trees sloping down toward a distant stream. The cabin was basic but comfortable. A narrow bed pushed against the wall in the main room, a little kitchen tucked into the corner, and a single bathroom with a window so small I had to bend down to look out of it. It was quiet up there. No cell service, no hum of traffic, no lights from neighbors. At first, it felt peaceful. The kind of place where you could sit with a cup of coffee in the morning and hear nothing but wind moving through the trees. The first couple of days passed slowly. I hiked, I read, I cooked my meals on the old stove, and when night came, I lit a small fire and let the crackle of wood fill the silence. There was a kind of stillness to the woods around me that I wasn't used to. During the day, it felt like the world had stopped. but at night the quiet grew heavier. Every little sound outside, the snap of a branch, the scurry of an animal in the brush, seemed sharp and amplified in the darkness. It was the third night when everything changed. I had gone to bed later than usual, closer to midnight, after sitting by the fire until the last log had burned down. The air outside was cold, the cabin floor chilly on my feet, so I locked the back door, checked the front, and slid under the heavy blanket. I drifted off quickly, the way you do when the day has been long and you're far from the usual distractions. I don't know what time I woke up, only that it was still dark outside. My eyes adjusted slowly to the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the thin curtains. At first, I wasn't sure what pulled me out of sleep, but then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. On the wooden floor near the bed were faint smudges, darker than the rest of the boards. I squinted, sat up a little, and leaned closer. They weren't smudges, they were footprints, bare feet, muddy, leading from the back door across the floor, straight to where I was lying. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I just stared, my mind sluggish but trying to make sense of it. The cabin wasn't big, so I could follow the trail with my eyes. The prints started near the back door, spaced evenly apart, and led directly to my bed. There they stopped, no prints going back. The air felt heavier as I sat up fully. My first thought was that I had somehow left the door open, that maybe I'd forgotten to lock it before bed. But when I looked across the cabin, I saw the back door, and the latch was still drawn. It was locked, just as I remembered. That detail froze me more than the prints themselves. Whoever or whatever had left them would have had to unlock the door, walk barefoot across the floor, stand at my bed, and then lock the door again before vanishing. But the prints ended right at me. There was no trail leading away. I got up slowly, the boards creaking under my weight, and checked the door. The lock was firm. No damage, no sign it had been forced. My hands shook a little as I turned the knob, but it held. The window by the kitchen sink was still closed. The bathroom window was shut too. Everything was sealed tight, yet the floor told me otherwise. I followed the prints again, this time crouching down. They were clear. 5 toes, the heel, the arch. Not big, but not small either, an adult's foot. The mud was still damp, smearing slightly when I brushed it with my finger. That meant they were fresh, not something I had missed earlier in the day. I spent the rest of that night sitting in a chair by the door with the fire poker in my lap, watching the shadows stretch and fade as the first light of morning came through the windows. My heart didn't slow down until the sun was high enough that the cabin felt warm again. In daylight, I searched the place. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any sign of tracks outside, but the ground was covered in leaves. If there had been prints, the wind or dampness had blurred them out. I checked the locks again and again. They were old but solid. I looked at the ceiling, the crawl space under the bed, the narrow pantry closet. Nothing. The cabin was empty, but the prints stayed. I didn't clean them right away because I wanted to convince myself I hadn't imagined them. All through the day, every time I glanced at the floor, they were there. A perfect trail of muddy bare feet, stopping right at my bed. By the second night, I couldn't relax. Every creak in the walls made me sit up. Every gust of wind rattling the glass felt like a warning. I barely slept, waiting to hear the sound of someone moving across the boards again. But nothing came. On the third morning, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a full week, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that place. The footprints proved it. Someone had been there, inside with me, close enough to watch me as I slept. The locked door didn't change that fact. When I finally left, I looked back once at the cabin from the gravel road. In the daylight, it looked harmless, just a small wooden house tucked into the trees. But I couldn't stop picturing those wet, barefoot tracks, how they appeared inside without explanation, how they ended at the edge of my bed as if someone had stood there in silence, looking down at me. I never found out how they got in or where they went. I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had been in that cabin with me. I didn't care about the mystery anymore. I just cared that I was gone, that I had left before another night fell, before those prints appeared again. Even now, I still see them when I close my eyes. The outline of toes pressed into the wood, the damp smudges that stopped where I slept. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a dream. Someone had walked inside and stood over me, and I'll never know why. I'll never forget that trip to Maine. A few friends and I had rented an old hunting cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, the kind of place where you lost cell service miles before you even pulled in. It was late October, crisp air and long nights, the perfect excuse for us to get away, build fires, and sit out on the porch with beers until we couldn't feel our fingers anymore. The cabin itself was rough, nothing fancy. A single floor with 2 bedrooms, a living space with a stone fireplace, and a screened-in porch that looked out over a clearing surrounded by tall pines. The wood siding was weathered gray, worn down by years of snow and rain, with patches where the grain stood out in ridges. Inside, the walls were lined with racks for rifles and antlers nailed above the doors. Reminders that this wasn't some rental cottage. It was a working hunting cabin, built for function, not comfort. During the day, it felt peaceful. We spent our time walking through the woods, following deer trails, and sitting by the fire splitting logs. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. At night, though, the woods changed. The silence wasn't really silence. You'd hear things out there. Branches snapping, dry leaves shifting, an owl echoing from far away. But what started bothering us wasn't just normal forest noise. It was the knocking. The first time it happened, we'd just finished eating. The fire inside was dying down, and the only light was from a single lantern on the table. That's when a dull thump came from one of the walls. Not a creak from the old wood, not a branch brushing against it. It was too deliberate. A heavy, hollow knock. We all froze, listening. Then another came from the backside of the cabin. 3 slow knocks, spaced apart like someone taking their time. We went outside with flashlights, thinking maybe it was an animal. The night air bit at our skin, and the beams cut across the clearing, catching nothing but the trees. The dirt around the cabin was scattered with pine needles. No clear tracks, no movement. Eventually, we went back inside, brushing it off as maybe a branch we hadn't noticed. But the knocking didn't stop. That night, lying in bed, I heard it again. Slow, steady raps against the wall, first on one side of the cabin, then another. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't even loud. It was the pace of someone testing the walls, moving around us, knocking as if to remind us we weren't alone out there. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, we all admitted we'd heard it too. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we were uneasy. We checked around again in daylight, circling the cabin. That's when we saw them. Claw marks. They were carved into the wood siding on the back wall, a set of 4 deep grooves dragging down across the boards. They weren't scratches from a branch. The cuts were straight, parallel, and sank into the wood like something strong had raked across it. Worse than that was the height. The top of the marks started about 6 feet off the ground. We all just stood there staring. It didn't make sense. A bear, maybe, but bears didn't usually circle cabins at night, tapping on the walls. And the marks weren't fresh. They were damp with morning dew, but the edges of the wood fibers were still sharp, not weathered. Whatever made them had done it in the dark, while we were inside listening to the knocking. The rest of the day, the mood changed. We still went out into the woods, but every snapped branch put us on edge. Every sound made us stop and listen. By the time the sun dropped, none of us were in the mood to sit outside anymore. We lit a fire in the hearth, shut the door, and tried to focus on cards and drinks, pretending we weren't waiting for the knocks to start again. And of course, they did. It began with 3 solid thumps on the front wall, close enough that the lantern rattled on the table. Then silence. Then, minutes later, the sound shifted to the side wall, slower this time, like knuckles dragging along the boards between each hit. We sat in silence, every one of us stiff, heads turned toward the sound. Nobody moved for the door. Nobody wanted to open it. That night, the knocks went on for hours. Sometimes they were soft, a faint tap barely louder than the crackle of the fire. Other times they landed hard enough to make the wood vibrate. They never came from the same place twice in a row. Whatever it was, it moved around us, circling, hitting different walls, We heard no footsteps, no growls, no rustle of brush, just the knocks. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next sound. When the sun finally came, we walked outside again, dread weighing heavier than tiredness. And sure enough, the siding had more claw marks. New ones, this time on the front wall near the door. Same parallel gouges, same unnatural height, and the same fresh edges in the wood. That was enough for us. None of us said it out loud, but we all agreed without needing to. We packed our things before noon, stuffing sleeping bags into the truck, slamming the bed closed, and locking the cabin behind us. Nobody wanted to be the last one inside. On the drive back down the dirt road, I kept looking out the window at the trees closing in on both sides. The forest was still, quiet, almost calm again, as if nothing had happened. But my stomach stayed tight the whole way out. We never figured out what left those marks or why it circled us the way it did. Maybe it was a bear testing us. Maybe someone was messing with us, though I couldn't imagine a person clawing 6 feet up a cabin wall in the middle of the night. All I know is this, whatever it was, it wanted us to know it was there. It wanted us to hear it, to lie awake listening, to find those marks in the morning. Could have broken in if it wanted, but it didn't. It just circled and tapped, like it was playing a game we couldn't understand. I still think about that sometimes, when I'm lying in bed back home and hear a noise outside the window. The knocking never followed me, but the memory of it did. The sound of something intelligent moving around in the dark, close enough to touch, but never letting us see it. That hunting trip ended early, but it left something behind in my head that I can't shake. And the picture of those claw marks, deep and high on the cabin wall, is something I'll never forget. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods of Oregon for a short break from everything. I wanted silence, time to myself, and a place far from traffic and people. The cabin was nothing fancy, just one story with a little porch, a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a bedroom tucked off the main room. It sat about half a mile down a dirt track from a barely used logging road, surrounded by thick trees on every side. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, stacked firewood, and took a walk down a trail that led toward a creek. The air was cool and damp, smelling like pine and wet leaves. When I came back that evening, I made a simple dinner, lit a small fire in the stove, and read until I felt drowsy. By 9, the woods outside had gone pitch black. No streetlights, no glow from houses, no hum of cars. Just a wall of darkness pressing against the windows. I was asleep before midnight, but at some point in the night, I woke to a sound that at first didn't register. It was faint, low, and strangely steady. I lay there, still half asleep, trying to place it. Then it hit me, it was humming. Someone was humming a tune right outside my bedroom window. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I could tell it wasn't coming from inside my head. The sound carried through the glass like a slow vibration, deliberate and even. My heart kicked hard in my chest as I turned my head toward the window, but the curtains were drawn tight. Couldn't see out. I didn't move. I just lay there frozen, listening. The humming went on for a while, pausing now and then as if the person outside was taking a breath or thinking of the next part. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a simple tune, the kind someone might do absent-mindedly while passing time. I stayed rigid until eventually the sound faded, and silence filled the cabin again. I didn't fall back asleep for hours. The next morning, in the clear light of day, I tried to talk myself into believing it had been the wind, or maybe I had dreamed it. But the sound had been too distinct, too human. Still, I didn't see any sign of footprints or disturbance outside the window, so I pushed it from my mind. The second night, I wasn't surprised when it happened again. Right around 2 in the morning, the humming returned. Same window, same low, steady tune. I felt the same tightness in my chest, the same cold sweat spreading across my skin. I didn't move, didn't dare get up to look. It felt like if I pulled the curtain back and saw whoever was there, something would break in me. Again, the sound lasted long enough to make me lose track of time. Then it stopped. By the third night, I was on edge before I even went to bed. I left a lamp on in the living room, kept the fire going low in the stove, and sat awake staring at the clock. When 2 a.m. came, the humming began, like it had been waiting for me. My throat went dry. I couldn't hear footsteps, just the sound of that tune seeping through the glass. It was the exact same pace as the other nights, like whoever was out there had practiced it. I wanted to do something, turn on the porch light, shout, anything, but fear kept me in place. I felt sure that if I drew attention to myself, if I acknowledged it, I'd regret it. So I lay there stiff until the sound stopped again, sometime close to dawn. By that point, I hadn't slept properly in days. The cabin no longer felt safe. The woods no longer felt quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder when I went outside, expecting to see someone stepping out from behind a tree. On the fourth night, I braced myself. I sat up in bed, staring at the window, listening so hard my ears rang. But 2 a.m. came and went, and there was nothing. No humming, no sound, just the stillness of the forest. The silence should have calmed me, but it didn't. If anything, it made the hair on my arms stand up worse than before, because the routine had been broken, and that felt deliberate. Whoever had been out there knew what they were doing, and now they had stopped on their own terms. When morning came, I went outside, moving slowly. My stomach knotted. I walked to the side of the cabin beneath my bedroom window. That's when I saw them, a pile of cigarette butts. Not scattered, not old and weathered, but fresh. Dozens of them stubbed out in the dirt, all collected in one spot directly under where my head had been each night. The ground was blackened with ash and the filters were damp from the dew. I crouched down and counted at least 30. Whoever had been standing there had spent hours beneath that window, smoking one after another, humming to themselves while I lay a few feet away on the other side of the glass. That was enough for me. I went back inside, packed my bag in minutes, and didn't even bother tidying up. I left the cabin just after sunrise, throwing everything in the car and driving out fast over the dirt road. My hands were tight on the wheel, and I didn't stop until I reached the main highway miles away. I never went back. I didn't call the rental office. I didn't want to explain what I had found, or worse, hear that they'd had complaints like that before. What haunts me most isn't just that someone was out there. It's the routine of it. The same time every night, the same low humming, the quiet patience of someone standing in the dark, smoking and watching. For 3 nights straight they were there, and when they finally stopped, it wasn't because they left. It was because they were finished. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know this. They had been close enough to touch the glass, close enough to hear me breathe, and for 3 nights, I lay there frozen, while they stood on the other side, humming in the dark. I had been out in Alaska for nearly a week, running my trapline in the backcountry. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones was everywhere. Air so sharp it stung when you breathed in too fast, snow piled deep and crusted hard at the surface. I had a small trapping cabin I used as shelter when I pushed too far from town to head back in the same day. It wasn't much more than a box of logs with a bunk, a stove, and shelves for gear, but it was a lifesaver in the middle of nowhere. That evening, I had hauled in later than usual, dragging my sled through the powder until my legs burned. I skinned what I had caught, hung the pelts, then heated a simple meal over the stove. By the time I settled onto the bunk, the sky outside was already deep black, the stars sharp as glass against it. The only sound was the faint pop of the firewood and the occasional shift of ice against the cabin walls. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first I thought it was nothing more than the wind pushing snow off the roof, but then I realized it was more deliberate, more steady. Footsteps. The sound was faint but distinct. The crunch of boots pressing into crusted snow. One after another, spaced evenly, close enough that they carried clear through the walls. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, crunch, crunch, crunch. I sat up, pulling the blanket off and slipping into my boots. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, the cabin dim, my breath fogging in front of me. The footsteps weren't moving away. They were circling. I stood still, my hand hovering near the rifle leaning against the wall. The crunching sound moved slow and steady, like someone pacing around, dragging out each step on purpose. It wasn't an animal. I'd lived long enough in these woods to know the rhythm of wolves, moose, even bear in the snow. This was two-legged. My heart pounded as I listened to it circle. Around the back, then to the side, then the front again. The sound of boots pressing into snow, crushing down ice with weight. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. After what felt like forever, the crunching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. My skin prickled as I waited, listening for any hint of movement. Nothing, just the faint whistle of wind over the chimney. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my coat, pulled the rifle into my hands, and unlatched the door. The cold slapped me as I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the snow. I raised the lantern and swept the light across the clearing. The trees stood silent, heavy with frost, their branches creaking faintly in the still air. My breath fogged thick and white, curling up and away into the dark. That's when I saw them. Footprints, clear as day in the lantern light, circling the cabin in a wide loop. They pressed deep into the snow, each one sharp-edged with a frozen outline, the tread of boots easy to see. They weren't fresh-fallen either. The snow hadn't had time to cover them. I walked slowly along the path they cut, the rifle tight in my grip. The prints went all the way around, wide arcs hugging the cabin walls. My chest tightened when I realized how close some of them came to the window by the bunk. Whoever it was had walked right past while I lay inside, listening. I followed the tracks around until they began to lead away, straight out into the clearing. I kept the lantern raised, breathing shallow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The prints stretched maybe 10 feet from the cabin, pressing deep into the crust. And then they stopped. Not faded, not covered, just stopped. One final boot print, solid and perfect in the snow, and beyond that, nothing but untouched white stretching into the dark. I stood there, lantern swinging slightly in my hand, my stomach sinking. The tracks didn't lead into the woods. They didn't veer off or scatter. They just ended as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I crouched down, brushing at the last print. It was deep, heavier than the rest, like more weight had pressed down into it. The edges were sharp. It hadn't melted, hadn't blown over. Beyond that mark, the snow was smooth, unbroken. I stayed out there longer than I should have, circling the area, sweeping the light out into the trees, trying to catch some sign I'd missed. But there was nothing. No other trail, no broken branches, no sign of where the person went. Just that circle of prints around the cabin and the sudden stop in the middle of the clearing. Eventually, with the cold biting through my gloves, I backed toward the cabin and shut myself inside again. I fed the stove until it roared, then sat on the bunk with the rifle across my knees, staring at the door. Sleep didn't come. Every creak in the walls, every shift in the fire made me tense up, waiting for the crunch of steps to start again. But they didn't. The night stretched long and empty until the first pale light of morning leaked through the frost on the window. In daylight, I went out again. The prints were still there, clear as before, circling and then stopping abruptly in the snow. I walked further out, scanning for any sign, but the ground was smooth. It looked like no one had been there at all except for those tracks. I can't explain it. I've tried to tell myself it was some trick of drifting snow, that I missed where the trail actually led, or that exhaustion played with my head. But I know what I saw. I know the sound of boots circling me in the night. I left the cabin that afternoon, hauling my gear back toward town. I didn't want to spend another night there, not after hearing those footsteps and seeing those tracks. I've been back in the woods plenty of times since, but I've never stayed in that cabin again. The worst part isn't the prints themselves. It's the fact that they came so close, walking slow circles around me while I slept. Whoever it was wanted me to hear them. They wanted me to know they were there. And the way the tracks ended, pressed deep in that final mark, still eats at me. It wasn't someone leaving. It felt like someone stopping, standing still in the snow, waiting, just beyond the circle of light from my window. I remember the day we pulled up to the cabin in Wisconsin. It was late autumn, the trees were bare, and the air had that heavy, damp chill that seeps into your clothes. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, the kind of place people used for hunting trips or to escape into the quiet for a few days. It wasn't big, but it had enough space for my family, my wife, our 2 kids, and me. The cabin sat on the edge of thick woods, the kind that looked endless once you stepped in more than a few feet. From the start, the place felt a little too quiet. No sound of cars, no far-off hum of a town. Just the wind moving through the bare branches and the occasional crack of something falling in the woods. It wasn't eerie at first, just different. We carried in our bags, set up inside, and settled into the routine of being out in the middle of nowhere. The cabin had a back porch that faced into the woods. That's where I liked to drink my coffee in the mornings, bundled in a jacket, watching the tree line. One morning, maybe the 3rd day we were there, I decided to take a walk into the woods while the kids were still sleeping. The ground was soft with layers of fallen leaves, and every step seemed to echo too loud in the still air. I wasn't more than a couple 100 yards from the cabin when I noticed something out of place. It was a trail camera. At first, I thought it was just one of the landowners. Hunters use them all the time, after all. But as I got closer, I realized 2 things that didn't sit right. 1, it was pointed directly at our cabin, specifically the back door. 2, it wasn't strapped to a tree in a way that looked old or weathered. It was fresh. The strap looked new. The camera casing didn't have much dirt or wear. It had been put there recently. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Something about the way it sat there, half hidden but clearly positioned, made my stomach tighten. This wasn't for deer or bear. It was set up to watch people. Watch us. I didn't touch it right away. I just walked back to the cabin, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe the owner of the cabin had put it there for security. But then, why not mention it? Why not face it at the driveway where someone would actually approach? Why hide it in the woods behind the place? When I told my wife, she gave me the look that said I was probably overthinking. She asked if maybe it was leftover from another hunter. But I couldn't shake the detail of it being aimed at the back door, not a game trail. Later that day, I went back out with gloves on and pulled the camera down. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and just stared at it. My wife didn't want to mess with it. She said we should leave it alone and just call the guy who owned the cabin. But something in me needed to know. So, against her wishes, I opened it. There was a memory card inside. I'll never forget the feeling of sliding that card into my laptop. My hands were sweating, my stomach tight. The first few files were nothing. Just black and white shots of deer moving through the trees at night. The kind of grainy images you'd expect. Then the angle shifted. The cabin came into view. Our cabin. I clicked through, one by one, and my unease grew heavier with every photo. There were shots of the back door, of the porch, of us unloading the car when we first arrived. My wife carrying bags. Me standing by the trunk. The kids running up the steps. Whoever set it up had done it before we even got there. The worst ones were the night shots. They showed the back door, faintly lit by the glow from inside. The timestamps matched the nights we had been sleeping. In one of them, my shadow was visible through the window as I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. In another, you could see my wife sitting on the couch, reading, completely unaware that a camera hidden in the trees was aimed right at her. But there was something else. In one photo, blurred at the edge, was a figure. It wasn't clear, but you could make out the outline of a person standing just inside the tree line, off to the side. The next photo didn't have them. Then a few frames later, they were closer. Still blurred, still half in shadow, but definitely there. Watching the cabin. I sat back in the chair, my mouth dry. It was one thing to think someone had been out there, another to see it captured like that. Someone had been close enough to watch us, close enough to move around at night without us knowing. I didn't say much to my wife right away. I didn't want to panic her, but I told her we needed to pack up and leave early. The excuse was that the weather might turn, and I didn't want to risk driving home on icy roads. She didn't argue. That last night, I barely slept. Every sound outside felt magnified. The wind rattling branches, a thump somewhere on the porch, even the creak of the old cabin settling. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for some sound of footsteps, some proof that whoever had been watching was still out there. Morning came without incident, and we loaded up the car as fast as we could. I left the camera on the table empty of its card. I didn't want to take it with me, but I didn't want whoever had placed it there to know I'd looked, either. When we got home, I called the guy who owned the cabin. He swore he had never set up any camera, never given anyone permission to be on the land. He sounded shaken when I told him. He said he'd check it out himself, but I never heard back on what he found. What sticks with me isn't just the camera or the photos. It's the thought that someone went through the effort of placing it, hiding it, checking it, and standing there at night watching. And if I hadn't walked into the woods that morning, I never would have known. We were being watched the whole time and we had no idea. That's what chills me the most.